The wind came first, a low moan across the prairie that promised violence. Then the snow followed, not in gentle flakes, but in horizontal sheets of ice that scoured the dying grass. Dusk fell like a hammer, bruising the gray sky to a deep, cold purple over the Wyoming foothills. Inside the stagecoach, the world was reduced to the sharp rattle of the windows and the rhythmic, weary pounding of the horses. Lydia Grace sat alone, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She was clutching a small, worn leather suitcase and, hidden within her fist, a simple gold band, her late husband's wedding ring. It was the only thing of value she had left from that life. The rest, the small rented farm, the tools, the debt, had been auctioned off. Now, she was cargo, same as the mail sack strapped to the roof, bound for a new life that felt just like an old grave. Her arranged remarriage awaited at the Boone Ranch, a name she knew only from 2 terse letters and the grim assurances of the circuit judge back in Laramie. "Mr. Boone needs a wife. Mrs. Grace," the judge had said, not unkindly. "And you, madam, need a roof. It is a practical match." Practical. The word felt as cold and thin as the air she breathed. The coach lurched, throwing her hard against the worn seat. It was slowing. Through the ice-caked window, she saw nothing but a wall of white. The driver, a man named Hatcher who had not spoken more than 5 words in 6 hours, cracked open the door. A blast of frigid air tore through the compartment, stealing her breath. "This is it, ma'am," he yelled over the howl of the storm. "The turnoff for the Boone place." Lydia looked out. There was no turnoff. There was no road. There was only the endless, churning void of the storm. "Here?" she asked, her voice sounding small and foolish. "But there is nothing here." "Ranch is 5 miles north," Hatcher said, already pulling her suitcase from the boot. He dumped it in the snowdrift by the side of the track. He was in a hurry, fighting the storm and the fading light. "Can't take the coach further. We'll founder in a drift. He knows you're coming this week." "But the storm." "He'll have a light on. Just keep the wind to your back and walk north. You can't miss the valley." He avoided her eyes, his face already numb with cold and impatience. He took the small fare she had tied in a handkerchief. Lydia stepped down from the coach. The snow was well past her ankles, the wind hitting her with the force of a physical blow. It ripped the hood from her head and plastered her thin wool coat against her body. She was a small, dark shape against a universe of white. "Godspeed, ma'am," Hatcher grunted. The door slammed. She heard the crack of his whip, the groan of the harness, and the heavy breathing of the horses. Then the coach was gone, swallowed by the snow in seconds. She was alone. The silence that fell was terrifying. It was not silence at all, but the deafening, high-pitched scream of the wind. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She was miles from any settlement. The sky was now completely dark. If she stood still, she would die. If she walked in the wrong direction, she would die. Clutching the handle of her suitcase, she turned her back to the wind, as the driver had said, and began to walk. It was not walking. It was a fight. Each step was a plunge into a freezing, uncertain depth. The suitcase, holding everything she owned, 2 worn dresses, her husband Thomas's shaving razor, and a tintype of her parents, felt like it was filled with lead. The cold found every gap in her clothing. It crept into her gloves, numbed her feet inside her worn boots, and burned her lungs with every breath. She kept her head down, counting steps that meant nothing. 100, 200. She lost track. The world was gone. There was no sky, no ground, only the driving snow and the burn in her legs. She thought of Thomas, of the simple warmth of his hand, and the thought brought a sharp, painful sob that the wind tore from her lips. She had survived his death from consumption. She had survived the auction, the shame, the whispers of the townswomen who thought her barren and unlucky. She would not die here, in the empty dark. She fell, Her knee struck something hard beneath the snow, a rock or a frozen root. The pain was immediate, sharp. The suitcase flew from her hand. For a long moment, she simply lay there, the snow already beginning to cover her. It would be so easy to close her eyes, so easy to sleep. Then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a star, but it was too low, too yellow, a light, faint, flickering, but undeniably real, a lantern glow, visible through the chaos. The sight broke her despair. It was a pinprick of hope in the vast darkness. She crawled to her suitcase, ignoring the throb in her knee, and grasped the handle, using it as a crutch. She pulled herself to her feet and lurched toward the light. It seemed to take another lifetime. The glow grew brighter, then defined itself, a single square of yellow in the darkness. A window. Below it, the dark mass of a cabin. Smoke, ripped from the chimney, was visible for only a second before the storm consumed it. She reached the door, a solid plank of wood that looked as weathered as the mountains. Her hands were too numb to knock. She leaned her shoulder against it and hammered with her elbow, using the last of her strength. She waited. The wind tried to pull her back from the small shelter of the doorway. She banged again, desperation giving her strength. "Please," she whispered, though no one could hear. "Please." The door creaked open. The sudden rush of warm, smoky air made her dizzy. A man stood in the opening, a massive silhouette against the low firelight within. He was tall, taller than anyone she had ever known, with broad shoulders that filled the entire frame. He held no lantern. He simply stood there, staring down at her. He was not what she had expected. He was young, perhaps 30. His hair was dark and shaggy, falling over his brow. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, deep-set, and filled with a profound, immovable sadness. He looked like a man who had not seen another human being in a very long time, and who was not pleased to be seeing one now. "Mr. Boone?" Lydia's voice was a ragged croak, flaked with ice. The man, Ellis Boone, just looked at her. His face was spare, all hard angles and shadows, covered in a rough beard. He did not move to let her in. I am Lydia Grace, from Laramie, the stage. The driver left me at the turnoff." His expression did not change, but a small muscle flickered in his jaw. His voice, when it came, was deep and rusty, as if he had not used it in weeks. "You are early." "The storm," she said, leaning against the doorframe, the world starting to swim. He said he could not come further. Elias Boone looked past her, into the white fury of the blizzard. He seemed to weigh her, the storm, and his own solitude. For a moment, she was certain he would close the door, leave her to the wind. Then, with a slow, reluctant sigh that seemed pulled from the depths of him, he stepped back. "Come in," he said. Lydia stumbled over the threshold, dragging her suitcase. The door shut behind her with a heavy, final thud. The sound of the wind was instantly muffled, reduced to a low howl outside the thick timber walls. She stood dripping and shaking in the middle of the small room, her lungs aching from the sudden warmth. The cabin was one room, spare and rough. The walls were raw logs, chinked with mud. A low fire burned in a stone hearth at one end, casting flickering shadows. In one corner, a single bed frame, neatly made with a dark wool blanket, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a few tins and a sack of flour. It was the cleanest, most desolate room she had ever seen. It was a room that held no joy. Elias Boone did not help her with her coat. He stood by the door, watching her, his presence dominating the small space. His discomfort was a tangible thing, sharp and brittle. "I was not expecting you," he said, his voice flat. "The wedding was set for 2 days from now. When the preacher arrives from town—" "I know. I am sorry," Lydia said, her teeth chattering. She fumbled with the frozen buttons of her coat. "The driver would not wait." "The road will be closed by morning," Elias said. It was not a conversation. It was a statement of fact. "The preacher will not be coming." He paused, and the weight of his next words filled the cabin. "You will have to stay the night." Lydia's head swam. To stay the night, alone, with this strange, silent man she was meant to marry. A man who looked at her as if she were a ghost or a threat. She looked at the single bed, and a cold dread, entirely different from the storm, settled deep in her stomach. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she managed, finally pulling off her wet gloves. Her hands were raw red, her fingers stiff. He nodded once, a curt, awkward gesture. He turned from her and moved to the fire, his movements jarringly silent for such a large man. He seemed afraid to make a sound, afraid to take up space, even in his own home. He gestured toward the fire. "You are cold." Lydia moved stiffly toward the hearth, holding her frozen hands out to the weak flames. She was intensely aware of him, of his stillness. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the wall, on the fire, anywhere but her face. She sensed it was not just shyness. It was something deeper, a resistance, a fear, as if looking at her would cost him something he could not afford to pay. He ladled something from an iron pot hanging over the coals into a wooden bowl. He set it on the table. "Stew," he said. He fetched another bowl for himself. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of their spoons and the relentless scream of the wind against the cabin walls. Lydia forced herself to eat the simple stew of salted meat and potatoes. The warmth spread through her, chasing away the worst of the chill, but it could not touch the coldness inside her. She watched him across the small table. The firelight caught the planes of his face, the sadness in his eyes. She noticed his hands as he held his spoon. They were large, calloused, but his knuckles were scarred and broken, the bones badly set, as if he had smashed them against something immovable. Her gaze drifted past him to a small, dark object on the mantel, a framed photograph, a tintype, of a family, a stern, bearded man, a woman with tired eyes so much like Elias's, and 2 young boys. "Your family?" Lydia asked, her voice quiet. Elias froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He did not look at the photo. He just stared into his bowl. He nodded. "They live in town?" She pressed gently, desperate to break the oppressive silence. "No." He set his spoon down. "They are dead." I am sorry." "It was a fire," he said, his voice completely empty of emotion. "Years ago, the old ranch house." Lydia fell silent. She remembered, then, a fragment of gossip from the judge's wife in Laramie. Something about the Boone family. "Tragedy out there," the woman had whispered. "His folks died in a fire. Some say it was not an accident." Lydia looked at the man across from her, this silent recluse with the broken hands and the dead eyes. She looked at the single bed, the isolated cabin, and the blizzard that locked them in. She was his property now, in exchange for a roof. When the meal was done, Elias collected the bowls and rinsed them in a bucket of water. The tension in the room grew thick and heavy as the last ritual of the evening was done. There was nothing left to do but face the night. He turned, wiping his hands on his trousers. Again, his eyes slid past her, refusing to meet hers. "You take the bed," he said. It was not an offer. It was a command. Lydia's throat tightened. "Mr. Boone, I cannot—" "Take it." He moved to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a single, worn horse blanket. He took it to the hearth, spread it on the rough floorboards, and added another log to the fire. He did not look at her. She hesitated, her heart pounding. She felt a strange, aching pity for this man. He was as trapped by this arrangement as she was, perhaps more. He was her husband-to-be, and he was sleeping on the floor, as far from her as the small cabin would allow. She was grateful for the distance and ashamed of her gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a single, curt nod, his back still to her. Lydia did not undress. She was too cold, too frightened. She took off only her wet boots, setting them by the fire to dry. She climbed onto the narrow bed and pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her chin. The mattress was firm, stuffed with straw, and it smelled faintly of him, of pine smoke, cold air, and something lonely. Elias Boone settled onto the floor, his back to her, facing the fire. He lay perfectly still, a large, dark shape in the flickering light. Lydia lay awake, listening. The wind howled, pressing against the logs, seeking entry. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls, on the silent man on the floor. The tension in the cabin was a living thing, a third presence in the room. Two strangers, bound by a contract they both regretted, waiting for a storm to pass. Lydia woke to a world that had not changed. The wind, which she thought must have exhausted itself, had found a new, deeper voice. It was no longer a scream. It was a roar. The small window was a solid, opaque white, plastered over with a thick shroud of snow. The cabin was colder than it had been. The fire, a pile of sullen red embers. Elias was already gone. She sat up, pulling the thick blanket around her shoulders. The floorboards were ice-cold to her feet. His horse blanket was folded neatly by the hearth, exactly where he had slept. A fresh pile of firewood was stacked by the door, and the water bucket, which had been low, was now half full of melted snow. He had been up for hours, moving in silence, tending to the necessities of survival while she slept. The door opened, and he entered in a blast of white fury. He was covered in snow, his eyebrows and beard caked with ice. He carried a half-frozen rabbit in one gloved hand. He did not look at her, but moved to the small washstand, brushing the snow from his coat with sharp, angry motions. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice small in the roar of the wind. He nodded, his back to her. "The storm is worse. It has settled in. We will be here for days." "Days?" The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lydia felt a lurch of panic, quickly suppressed. She was a practical woman. Panic was a luxury she could not afford, any more than she could afford silk or sugar. "Then we must be careful with the food," she said, rising from the bed and immediately moving to fold the blanket. She would not be idle. She would not be a burden. He grunted in agreement, skinning the rabbit with practiced, economical movements. His scarred knuckles were stiff with the cold. The first day set the rhythm for the ones that followed. They were two silent partners in a grim dance of survival. Lydia took charge of the cabin. She portioned the food. A small bit of salted meat and potatoes for the stew. A carefully measured scoop of flour for flatbread. She melted snow for water, swept the floor, and mended a tear in her own worn dress, her stitches small and neat. Elias tended the outside world. He spent hours in the small, sturdy barn, tending his single horse and the two milk cows. He chopped wood. His axe strokes a dull, rhythmic thud against the screaming wind. He checked his traps, sometimes returning with a rabbit, sometimes with nothing. They spoke, but their words were like stones dropped into a deep well. They were functional, hollow sounds that marked the passage of time. "The flour is low," she would say. "I know," he would answer. "The wind has shifted. It will be colder tonight." But silence, Lydia learned, was its own kind of language. She began to read the shape of his quiet. His was not the comfortable silence of her late husband. Thomas. This was a guarded, wounded quiet. It was the silence of a man holding his breath, waiting for a blow to fall. On the third day, the coffee ran out. Lydia felt the loss disproportionately. It was the last small comfort, the last tie to a civilized world. She stood holding the empty tin, and for the first time, her composure cracked. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cold cheek. She wiped it away, angry with herself. Elias, entering the cabin, saw the motion. He stopped, his usual awkwardness freezing him by the door. He looked at the tin in her hand, then at her face. He said nothing, but his gaze, for just a second, lost its fearful distance. It was not pity. It was recognition. He knew what it was to be at the end of things. He turned and busied himself with the firewood, his motions more abrupt than usual. That evening, as she sat mending one of his torn work shirts, the fabric rough as bark under her fingers, she decided to speak. The silence had grown too heavy. It was pressing the air from the room. "My first husband, Thomas," she began, her voice steady, her eyes on her needle. "He was a good man, gentle." Elias, who was oiling a piece of harness by the fire, went perfectly still. His hands stopped their work. "He was not practical," she continued, pulling the thread taut. "He bought seed he could not afford. He trusted men who should not be trusted. When the drought came, we lost everything. Then the consumption took him. He died in debt." She paused, swallowing against the familiar, dry ache in her throat. "When he was gone, the creditors took the farm. They took the furniture. They even took my wedding china. I was left with his name and his debts." She looked up, meeting his eyes across the small space. He was watching her, his face a mask in the firelight, but his eyes were alert, trapped. "The women in town," she said, her voice dropping. "They began to whisper. They said I was unlucky, that I brought ruin. It is hard to find work when people believe you are cursed. This marriage," she gestured at the cabin, at him, "was not a choice. Mr. Boone, it was a rescue. I had nowhere else to go." Elias looked down at the leather in his lap. He worked the oil into it with a rag, his scarred knuckles moving slowly. He did not speak for a long time. The wind moaned, rattling the door latch. "My name," he said finally, his voice so low she barely heard it, "is not a rescue. It is its own curse." He said no more, but Lydia felt something shift in the room. She had offered a piece of her brokenness, and he had matched it, in his own spare way. His fear of her, however, did not lessen. It grew worse. As the cabin shrank around them, her very presence seemed to hurt him. If she passed him the salt, he would flinch, his hand pulling back as if from a flame. When she tried to help him stack the firewood he brought in, he recoiled so sharply he dropped a log. "I can do it," he said, his voice harsh. "I only mean to help, Mr. Boone." "Do not," he said, his back to her. He would not look at her. She retreated, stung. It was more than shyness. She had seen shy men. They were awkward. They blushed. They stammered. Elias was not shy. He was terrified. He moved around her as if she were made of glass, or perhaps of poison. He seemed to hold a deep, physical restraint, as if he were fighting a constant battle to keep his hands at his sides, to keep himself locked inside his own skin. She sensed that his fear was not of her, but of himself, of what he might do if he let himself get too close. The breaking point came on the 5th night. The storm had reached a fever pitch, a solid wall of sound that vibrated in their bones. The supplies were dangerously low. The stew was thin, mostly broth, and the last of the flatbread was gone. They sat in a strained, hungry silence. Lydia sewing by the fire, Elias staring into the flames. His big shoulders slumped. A sound tore through the wind's howl. It was not the wind. It was a loud, splintering crash from the barn, followed by the terrified, high-pitched bawling of a cow. Lydia jumped, her needlework falling to the floor. Elias moved faster than she had ever seen him move. He was not the slow, hesitant man of the cabin. In 1 second, he was on his feet, his face pale, his eyes wide with a wild, primal panic. He grabbed the rifle that rested above the mantel, his hands fumbling with the lever. Mr. Boone, what is it? Get away from the door, he commanded, his voice a raw bark. He shoved her, not gently, toward the hearth. He did not seem to be checking for an intruder. He seemed to be expecting an invasion. He raised the rifle, his whole body tense, and pointed it at the door. It came from the barn, Lydia said, her heart pounding. The cattle. The sound of the bawling cow seemed to register. His panic faltered, replaced by a terrible confusion. He lowered the rifle slowly. The barn, he whispered, as if remembering. He dropped the rifle on the bed and grabbed his heavy coat. He did not bother with buttons, but simply plunged his arms into it and tore the door open. The storm engulfed him instantly. Lydia did not hesitate. His panic was too raw, too deep. It was not the reaction of a sane rancher. She grabbed her own thin coat and plunged out after him. The world outside was a nightmare of white, stinging ice. The air was so cold it felt like breathing fire. She could not see him. The barn was only 30 yards from the cabin, but it was invisible. Elias, she screamed, using his first name without thinking. She heard a shout, muffled by the wind, and stumbled toward it. The snow was hip-deep in a drift by the door. She fell, scrambling on her hands and knees. She found him just inside the barn door. The interior was dark, smelling of hay and cold manure. His lantern, which he must have grabbed from a peg, cast a frantic, swinging light. The crash had been a section of the roof, a heavy support beam, weighted with more snow than it could bear, had snapped. It had fallen across one of the empty stalls, missing the animals. The cows were terrified, pulling at their tethers. His horse stamped and whinnied in its stall. But Elias was not looking at the roof. He was staring at the back corner, where a new calf, born just the week before, lay on its side. It was half buried in a drift of snow that had poured through the broken wall. It was not moving. Elias stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged, visible clouds. He was staring at the calf, but Lydia knew he was not seeing it. He was seeing something else, some other ruin, some other night. It is frozen, he whispered. His voice was that of a lost child. No, Lydia said, pushing past him. She waded through the snow. The calf was stiff, its coat covered in ice. But when she put her hand to its muzzle, a tiny, warm breath huffed against her palm. It is alive, just half frozen. We must warm it. Elias did not move. He was useless, locked in his own terror. The lantern light caught his hands. They were shaking, not a tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable quake. So severe he could barely hold the lantern. Elias, she said, her voice sharp, cutting through his fog. Help me. We must get it to the cabin. He looked at her, his eyes blank. He dropped the lantern in the snow. It sputtered and went out, plunging them into near darkness. He sank to his knees. He just knelt there in the snow and the filth of the barn. His head bowed. He had collapsed, not from the cold, but from the weight of his own fear. Lydia's fear vanished, replaced by a fierce, sudden clarity. She righted the lantern and struck a match from the box on the wall, her own hands steady. The light flared up. She left the calf. She went to him. He was a great, dark shape, folded in on himself. He was shaking all over. She reached out and touched his shoulder. He flinched, but did not pull away. It is all right, she said, her voice low and firm. She unbuttoned her own coat and wrapped it around the small, stiff body of the calf. Then she went back to Elias. He had dropped his own heavy coat in his panic on the way out. It lay by the door. She picked it up. He was still on his knees, shivering. She did not ask him to stand. She draped the heavy sheepskin coat over his broad shoulders, pulling the collar up around his neck. It was an act of pure, uncomplicated comfort. She knelt in front of him, forcing him to look at her. It is just a calf, she said softly. It is not the end of the world. It is just some snow. Her touch seemed to anchor him. He stared at her, his breathing ragged. He looked at the coat she had wrapped around him, his expression one of profound, agonizing confusion. Her hand still rested on his shoulder. She did not pull it away. It lingered, a small point of warmth in the icy dark. Finally, he nodded, a single jerky motion. "Help me," she said again. Together, they lifted the calf. Elias's strength returned in a flood. He scooped the small animal up as if it weighed nothing. He carried it, and Lydia carried the lantern. They fought their way back to the cabin, the wind at their backs, pushing them home. Inside, the warmth was a shock. Elias laid the calf on the floorboards by the hearth, on his own sleeping blanket. Lydia began rubbing it vigorously with a dry sack, trying to bring the life back to its limbs. Elias just stood there, dripping, his hands still shaking, though less violently now. "Your hands," Lydia said, looking up. "They are frozen." He looked down at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. They were bright red, already showing the pale white patches of frostbite. In his panic, he had not even worn his gloves. "Sit," she said, pointing to the chair. He obeyed, collapsing into it. He looked exhausted, broken. Lydia retrieved her sewing basket. From it, she took a small tin of salve. She dipped a clean rag into the warm water bucket and knelt before him. Gently, she took his left hand in hers. It was huge, rough, the scars on his knuckles standing out against the raw skin. He stiffened, his entire body going rigid. "Be still," she whispered. "This will hurt if we let it set." She began to clean his fingers, her touch as light as she could make it. He was trembling, but it was a different tremor now. It was not the violent shaking of panic. It was a deep, internal vibration. He watched her, his eyes fixed on her bowed head, on her small hands tending to his. When she had cleaned them, she took a small amount of the salve and began to massage it into his skin. Her movements were slow, methodical. She worked the warmth back into his fingers, one by one. The intimacy of the act was staggering. It filled the small cabin, thicker than the smoke, warmer than the fire. He did not pull away. He sat, captive, enduring her touch. When she was finished, she looked up. Her face was only inches from his, and their eyes met. It was, as she would later recall, the first time they had truly looked at each other. She saw past the fear, past the sadness. She saw the man trapped inside, ashamed and silent. And he saw her. He saw not the bad luck widow, not the burden, not the arranged wife. He saw Lydia. He saw her strength, her quiet competence, her kindness. And in that moment, for the first time, there was no shame between them. Only a raw, terrified, and deeply human connection. She held his gaze for a long moment, then slowly released his hand. She rose and turned back to the calf, which had begun to shiver, its eyes fluttering. The next day, the world was new. The storm had not broken, but the worst of its fury was spent. The wind had dropped to a low, steady moan. The calf was alive, standing weakly by the fire. And Elias was different. He did not speak more, but his silence had changed. The terrible, brittle fear had eased. He still kept his distance, but it was a softer distance. When she handed him his cup of thin tea, he took it, and his fingers brushed hers. He did not flinch. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. She began to see the gentleness in him, the parts of himself he kept so carefully hidden. She watched him with the calf, his large, scarred hands moving with surprising tenderness over its small body. She followed him to the barn. He did not object, and watched him with his horse. He spoke to the animal, his voice a low, soothing murmur that she had never heard him use with a person. He was a man who understood animals better than people. He knew their hurts, their simple needs. She watched him as he stood by the window, staring out at the white, endless expanse. He was a man who knew how to listen to the silence. He was not bored by it, or angered by it. He seemed to fit into it, as if he were a part of the snow and the wind and the cold. A strange thing began to happen to Lydia as the days blurred. A feeling she thought had died with Thomas, a feeling she had buried under layers of grief and shame and practicality, began to stir. It was a warmth deep in her belly, a slow, aching longing. It frightened her. It was a longing for this strange, broken man who was to be her husband. It was a desire not just for safety, but for connection. For him. The emotional closeness, built in silence and shared crisis, became almost unbearable. The cabin was too small. His presence was too large. She was aware of his breathing, of the way the firelight caught the silver in his dark beard, of the sadness in his eyes that was now mixed with a new, hesitant awareness of her. That night, the 6th night, she lay in the bed, and he lay on the floor. The calf was sleeping peacefully by the hearth. The cabin was quiet, the wind only a whisper. She could not sleep. She stared at the rough log ceiling, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She knew he was not asleep either. She could hear the restless shift of his body on the hard floor, the quiet, unsteady rhythm of his breathing. He was staring at the fire, just as she was staring at the ceiling. The tension was a wire, pulled taut between the bed and the floor. It was a living thing, full of unasked questions and unspoken needs. Lydia could not bear it. She could not bear his loneliness. She could not bear her own. She turned her head, looking at his dark shape. "Elias," she whispered, her voice soft in the quiet. He tensed. He did not move, but she knew he was listening. "Please," she whispered, the word costing her more courage than facing the storm. "Come sit by the fire. The floor is too cold. You will be sick." He did not move for a full minute. She thought he would refuse, that he would retreat back into his frozen silence. Then, slowly, with the reluctance of a man walking to his own execution, he rose. He did not stand, but sat on the floor, his back against the hearth, facing the room, facing her. She sat up in the bed, pulling the blanket around her. The firelight flickered between them. He looked at the floor, his hands clasped between his knees. His presence, so close, was overwhelming. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the simple, solid fact of him. "You were good with the calf," she said softly. He nodded, still not looking at her. "My father, he taught me about stock." It was the first time he had mentioned his father. The word dropped into the silence, heavy and cold. They sat like that for a long time. The only sound was the fire. He was so close. She could see the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. She saw a man who had been alone for so long he did not know how to be otherwise. Her hand moved, seemingly of its own accord. She reached out, across the small space between the bed and the hearth. She did not touch his face, or his arm. She simply laid her hand on top of his, where they were clasped together. His entire body went rigid. A sharp, ragged breath hissed through his teeth. He did not pull away. He stared at her hand on his, her small, pale hand covering his large, scarred one. He stared at it as if it were a burning coal, a thing of impossible heat and terrible danger. He did not move. He did not breathe. But beneath her palm, she felt it, a fine, deep tremor that ran from his hand up his arm. He was shaking, not from fear this time, or not only from fear. It was the trembling of a man who was starving, and who had just been offered bread, and who was terrified to take it, terrified of the wanting. The silence woke her. For 6 days, the world had been a constant, high-pitched scream. The wind had been a physical weight, pressing against the cabin, burrowing into the chinking, rattling the door. Now, there was nothing, just a profound, heavy stillness. Lydia opened her eyes. The cabin was filled with a light so bright it was painful. It was not the gray, weak light of the storm, but a brilliant, clean white that poured through the small window, reflecting off every surface. She sat up. Elias was not on the floor. His blanket was folded. He was standing by the window, his back to her, staring out at the new world. "It is over," he said. His voice, in the vast quiet, sounded unoveringly loud. Lydia rose from the bed, her feet hitting the cold floor. She joined him at the window, keeping a careful distance. The sight stole her breath. The prairie was gone, buried under a rolling ocean of white. The snowdrifts were sculpted by the wind into waves and cliffs, some higher than the cabin roof. The sky was a sharp, aching blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of water melting from the eaves. The storm had broken them, and then it had passed, leaving them altered. They had survived. They had spent 6 days in this small, rough room, a space that had become their entire universe. The town, the preacher, the very concept of a wedding. It all felt thin and distant, like a story told about other people. In the cabin, they had built an unspoken bond. It was a fragile thing, woven from shared fears, small kindnesses, and long silences. It was the night he had trembled by the fire. It was the sight of his large, scarred hands being so gentle with the calf. It was the way her hand had rested on his, and the way he had not pulled away. Now, the outside world was waiting. Elias turned from the window. The light caught the deep sadness in his eyes, but also the new, hesitant awareness of her. The fear was still there, but it was softer, shadowed by the memory of her touch. "The drifts are deep," he said, pulling on his boots. "But the wind has scoured the ridges. The road to town should be passable by this afternoon, if we ride carefully." Town. The word landed in the quiet room with a dull thud. Lydia's stomach tightened. The preacher, the wedding, the contract. She nodded, turning from the window. "I will pack the supplies we need to buy. What is left of the list?" As she moved about the cabin, gathering the empty flour sack and the small tin of coffee, a cold uncertainty settled over her. She looked at Elias. He was checking his rifle, his movements stiff and practical again. The man who had trembled by the fire was gone, replaced by the reclusive rancher. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that she did not want the wedding. The thought was terrifying. She needed this marriage for survival, for a roof, for a name that was not cursed. But her heart, a thing she had thought long dead, had treacherously reawakened. She did not want the cold, practical match the judge had arranged. She wanted this man. She wanted the quiet man who spoke to horses, the broken man who knelt in the snow, the gentle man who was so terrified of his own hands. She wanted the bond they had forged in the storm, and she was terrified that the town, the preacher, and a piece of paper would shatter it. The ride to town was slow. Elias broke the trail, his horse pushing through the deep drifts. Lydia followed. The world a vast, blinding white. The air was clean and cold. The silence broken only by the crunch of hooves in the snow and the occasional call of a snowbird. They rode side by side when the ridge was clear, close enough to feel the warmth of each other's bodies. But they did not speak. The silence that had been a comfort in the cabin now felt heavy with unspoken questions. The town, when they finally reached it, was a raw scar in the clean snow. It was a single muddy street, lined with false-fronted buildings, all buried in drifts. Men were everywhere, shoveling rooftops, digging out pathways, their voices loud and rough in the clear air. They tied their horses at the rail in front of the mercantile. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the shoveling stopped. The talking quieted. Every eye turned to them. To Elias Boone, the madman of the foothills, and to her, the widow who had been trapped alone with him for nearly a week. Lydia felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She pulled her thin cloak tighter and kept her eyes on the door. Elias, beside her, seemed to grow larger and more still, his face settling into the blank, closed-off mask she had first seen. The inside of the mercantile was warm, crowded, and smelled of wet wool, coffee, and chewing tobacco. The room went quiet as they entered. Mrs. Davies, the proprietor's wife, stopped weighing beans. Two ranchers by the stove stopped their conversation. Lydia felt their stares. They were not curious, they were judgmental. The women looked at her with a mixture of pity and sharp, cruel speculation. They saw a fallen woman, a burden, a woman of bad luck who had clearly compromised herself to survive. The men looked at Elias. They gave him a wide berth, their eyes wary. They did not see a neighbor. They saw Boone's boy. They saw the shadow of a violent father and a suspicious fire. They saw the mad family blood. Lydia ignored them. She would not give them the satisfaction of her shame. She walked directly to the counter with her small list. Mrs. Davies, we need flour, coffee, and salt, and 20 pounds of oats, if you have them. Mrs. Davies, a thin woman with pursed lips, began to scoop the flour, her movements stiff with disapproval. The preacher got turned back by the storm. Mrs. Grace, he is staying at the parsonage. Says he will try for your wedding tomorrow. If the pass is clear. She said your wedding with a sharp emphasis, as if it were a joke. Thank you for the information, Lydia said coolly. It is a blessing you found shelter, I am sure, the woman added, her voice dripping with implication. Mr. Boone's cabin is isolated. Before Lydia could reply, a voice cut through the quiet store. Well, if it is not the unlucky Mrs. Grace. Lydia froze. She knew that voice. She turned slowly. A man was leaning against the far counter, a smirk on his thick, ruddy face. His name was Silas Croft. He had been her husband's largest creditor, a man who had made his money lending at ruinous rates. He was the one who had taken her china. Mr. Croft, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself off the counter and walked toward her. He was dressed in a town suit, despite the snow, and he smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars. He stopped a few feet away, looking her up and down with an insolent appraisal. I heard the storm caught you, he said, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. Landed on your feet, I see, or perhaps, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. You landed on your back. It is the only thing a woman like you has left to trade, is it not? The store went dead silent. The only sound was the crackle of the stove. Lydia felt as if she had been slapped. The heat in her face was scalding. She saw the grins on the faces of the ranchers by the stove, the cold, satisfied look in Mrs. Davies's eyes. She did not see Elias. He had been at the back of the store, hefting a sack of oats. He just stopped. He did not turn around. He simply set the heavy sack down. The thud was loud in the silence. Then he turned. He moved with none of his usual hesitation. His quiet fury was a terrible thing to behold. It was not loud. It was a cold, complete stillness. He walked past Lydia, his eyes locked on Silas Croft. Croft's smirk faltered. He was a town bully, not a fighter. He had mistaken Elias's reclusive nature for weakness. Now, Boone, this is not your affair. Elias did not speak. He did not slow down. When he reached Croft, he hit him. It was not a brawl. It was a single, economical movement. A heavy, brutal blow that landed with the sickening, wet sound of bone breaking. Silas Croft collapsed like a sack of grain, his hands flying to his face. Blood poured through his fingers, dark red against the dusty floorboards. He cried out, a high, bubbling sound. The store erupted. Mrs. Davies screamed. The men by the stove jumped back, overturning a chair. Elias just stood there, breathing hard, staring down at the man he had struck. His hands were clenched at his sides, his scarred knuckles white. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a terrible, vibrating rage. "Sheriff! Get the sheriff!" someone yelled. The door burst open. and Sheriff Brody entered, his face grim. He was a broad, tired-looking man who had seen too much. He took in the scene at a glance, Croft on the floor, Lydia pale as death, and Elias standing over the man, coiled and dangerous.
"Elias,"
the sheriff said, his voice low and heavy. He put his hand on Elias's arm. Elias flinched, but the touch seemed to break his trance. The fury drained out of him, leaving him looking hollowed out, his eyes wide and haunted. "He had it coming. Silas," the sheriff said to the man on the floor, who was moaning and spitting blood. "You know better than to poke a bear." Croft glared up at him, one hand clutching his ruined nose. He broke my nose! He is crazy! Arrest him!" The sheriff sighed. He looked at Elias, his gaze not unkind, but full of a weary pity. "Get your supplies, son, and go. Pay Mrs. Davies." He leaned in, his voice dropping so only Elias and Lydia could hear. "You ride out now. You ain't right in the head. Elias, you know that. The town knows it. Do not make me lock you up." Elias did not speak. He looked like a man in a dream. He retrieved the sack of oats, walked to the counter, and dropped several coins. He did not wait for change. He grabbed Lydia's arm. His grip was hard, impersonal, his fingers digging into her cloak. It was not a gentle touch. It was the grip of a man desperate to escape. He pulled her out of the store, into the blinding sunlight and the judgment of the town. The ride back to the ranch was a torment. The silence was no longer heavy. It was sharp and jagged. Elias rode ahead, pushing his horse, his back a rigid, unapproachable wall. He had not looked at her. He had not said a word. Lydia followed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The humiliation in the store was a dull ache, but it was nothing compared to the guilt she felt now. She had done this. Her past, her bad luck, had followed her, and it had forced Elias to become the very thing he despised. When they reached the cabin, he swung down from his horse and began to unstrap the supplies, his movements jerky and violent. He would not look at her.
"Elias,"
she said, her voice trembling. He ignored her, hefting the sack of oats.
"Elias, please."
She stepped in front of him, forcing him to stop.
"I am so sorry. I brought this on you. I brought his insults. The town, they have always seen me that way."
He stopped, the sack resting on his thigh. He stared over her head, at the snow-covered peak in the distance. His voice was flat, dead. "It was not you. It was him. He was talking. He should not have been talking. You defended me." "No," he said, his voice raw. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a self-loathing so profound it made her ache. "I hit him. That is all I did. I hit him." He pushed past her and carried the supplies into the cabin. Lydia stood by the horses, the cold seeping into her boots. She looked at his hands when he came back out, at the broken knuckles she had so gently tended. She finally understood. She understood the rumors, the whispers of mad family blood. She understood his terror of her touch, his flinching. It was not her he feared. It was himself. His father had been a violent man. The town whispered it, and the town whispered that Elias, in a desperate attempt to protect his mother, had set the fire that killed them both. He had lived with that label, madman, killer, for years. He had hidden himself away, tending his animals, avoiding all human contact, terrified that the violence in his blood would erupt. Today, in the mercantile, it had erupted. In defending her, he had proven to himself that the town was right. He was his father's son. He was a monster. He spent the rest of the day avoiding her. He was a whirlwind of frantic, needless energy. He chopped wood, splitting log after log, the axe strokes sharp, desperate cracks in the cold air. He mended a fence line that was buried under 4 feet of snow, working until the sun began to set, painting the snowfields in shades of pink and purple. He was trying to exhaust the violence out of himself. Lydia watched him from the cabin window, her heart breaking. She made stew, the smell filling the small room, but he did not come in. Darkness fell. The cabin was warm, a small yellow light in the vast, cold darkness. He was still out there. Finally, she could bear it no longer. She put on her cloak and stepped outside. The cold was immediate, sharp. He was standing by the woodpile, his axe dangling from one hand. He was staring at the cabin, at the light, like a man locked out of his own home.
"Elias,"
she said gently.
"come inside. The stew is hot."
He did not move.
"Please, you will freeze."
He let the axe fall. It thudded into the snow, slowly, like a man walking to his own hanging. He walked past her and into the cabin. He did not go to the fire. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands, his shoulders slumped. He looked trapped. His own home, a cage. The silence was terrible. She ladled stew into a bowl and held it out. He shook his head. She had to reach him. She had to pull him back from the brink. She set the bowl down and walked to him.
"Elias,"
she said, her voice low and steady. "What you did today, it was to protect me. It was not like him." He flinched as if she had struck him. He turned, his face ravaged in the dim light. "You know nothing about him."
"I know what they whisper," she said, standing her ground. "I know they say your father was a hard man, a cruel man. I know they say you."
"That I am mad," he finished, his voice broken. "That I am a killer. Like him." His eyes squeezed shut. "They are right. You saw it. You saw what I am."
"No."
She did it without thinking. She reached out and took his hand. He froze. His entire body went rigid. His hand was like a block of ice, stiff and unresponsive. He tried to pull it away, but she held on, her small hand covering his scarred knuckles.
"His was violence to hurt,"
she insisted, her voice fierce.
"Yours was to protect. You are not him. You are not your father."
He was overwhelmed. He was shaking. A deep, violent tremor that started in his hand and ran through his whole body. He kept his eyes shut, as if he could not bear to look at her, to see her touching the hand that had struck a man. She stepped closer, until she was standing directly in front of him. She could feel the shiver of his body. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper, forcing him to hear her.
"Elias?"
He made a small, pained sound.
She knew, in that moment, what she had to do.
It was a terrifying gamble. He believed he was a monster, capable only of violence. She had to show him he was a man, capable of tenderness. She had to prove that her touch was not a thing to be feared, but a thing to be wanted. She kept her voice a soft, steady whisper, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. "Please, take me to bed." His world shattered. His eyes flew open. They were wide with a raw, agonizing mixture of panic and a desperate, starving desire. He looked at her as if she had spoken in a foreign tongue, as if she had lit a match in a room full of powder. He could not move. He was paralyzed, caught between his terror of his own nature and a longing so deep it was shaking him apart. He was frozen. She knew she had to lead. Her own hands were trembling so badly she could barely command them, but she was certain. She let go of his hand. She lifted her fingers, not to him, but to the high collar of her own worn, gray dress. The cabin was dead silent. The only sound was the fire and the unsteady rasp of his breathing. She undid the first button. The small, bone button slid free from the loop. The sound was deafening. The moment was electric, stretched taut as a wire. It was not an act of seduction. It was an act of pure, terrifying faith. The small motion broke him. He made a sound, a choked gasp. "No," he whispered. He stumbled back, one step, then two, his hands coming up as if to ward her off. He hit the wall, his eyes wild. He fumbled for the door latch, his movements clumsy, panicked. He ripped the door open. He fled, He ran out into the freezing night without his coat, without his hat, running as if the cabin itself were on fire. Lydia stood alone in the center of the room, the cold night air rushing in, swirling around her ankles. She did not move. Her hand was still at her throat, her fingers resting on the undone button. The humiliation was a sharp, hot sting, but beneath it, a deeper, sadder emotion rose, understanding. She had not just offered him comfort. She had offered him the one thing he was convinced he would destroy. She had awakened the part of him he had kept buried in snow and silence for 10 years, the part he was terrified to face. Slowly, her fingers still trembling, she rebuttoned her dress. She walked to the open doorway and looked out into the empty, moonlit darkness where he had vanished. The cold burned her face. She did not call for him. She just stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel, watching and waiting. He did not return to the cabin that night. Lydia waited by the door, the cold air pooling on the floor, until her own shivering became uncontrollable. She finally shut the door, the latch clicking with a dreadful finality. The room was empty, the stew cold. She did not sleep in the bed. She sat in the chair by the hearth, the horse blanket wrapped around her, and watched the fire burn down to ash. She felt the humiliation, a cold, sharp sting, but it was overshadowed by a profound, aching sorrow, not for herself, but for the man who had run into the darkness, coatless, rather than face her touch. When the gray light of dawn finally came, she saw him. He was in the corral, already working, pitching hay with a frantic, punishing energy. He must have slept in the barn. And so the pattern was set. For the next 3 days, Elias avoided her as if she were the plague. He was a ghost in his own home. He rose before dawn, his movements in the barn a distant, muffled series of thuds. He worked from first light until well past dusk, tackling chores with a desperate, pointless fury. He chopped wood until the pile was higher than his head. He rechecked fences that were buried in snow, digging them out for no reason other than to exhaust his body. He did not come into the cabin to eat. Lydia would leave a plate of food on the porch step, and hours later, she would retrieve the empty plate, never catching sight of him. He was sleeping in the hayloft. The cabin, once their shared sanctuary against the storm, was now hers alone, and it had never felt so cold. The first day, Lydia felt the sting of rejection. She felt foolish, humiliated, ashamed of her own forwardness. She had misread everything. She had offered a comfort he did not want. By the second day, the rejection had faded, replaced by a deep and abiding pity. She would watch him from the window, a small, dark figure against the vast, white expanse, fighting the snow, fighting the wood, fighting himself, and she understood. She had seen that same panic in his eyes the night the roof beam crashed in the barn. She had seen it in the mercantile, just after his fist had connected with Croft's face. It was the same wild, trapped look he'd had when she undid the button of her dress. She realized, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that his fear had nothing to do with her. He was not afraid of her. He was terrified of himself. He was terrified of the violence he believed was coiled inside him, a snake waiting to strike. He had spent 10 years in solitude, learning to control it, and in 2 days, she had brought it to the surface, first in the store, with his rage, then in the cabin, with his desire. He saw them both as the same monster. To want was to destroy. To touch was to break. Her heart ached for him. He was a man in a cage of his own making, and she had rattled the bars. On the 3rd day, she made a decision. The preacher, Mr. Gideon, was due to ride up from town tomorrow, assuming the pass was clear. The wedding, the cold, practical contract, felt like a betrayal now. It was not what she wanted, and it was the last thing Elias needed. She sat at the small, rough-hewn table. She took out the last sheet of clean paper she owned, her small bottle of ink, and her pen. She wrote a letter. Her hand was steady. Reverend Gideon, I must ask you to delay your visit. The storm has left much work to be done at the ranch, and we are not yet prepared. Mr. Boone and I require more time. I will send word to town when we are ready. Sincerely, Mrs. Lydia Grace. She folded it. She would ride to the turnoff tomorrow and give it to the first rider she saw heading to town. It was a risk. It left her in a state of limbo. Not a wife, not a widow. Living in a man's house without the protection of his name. The town would whisper even louder. She did not care. She would not force this broken man into a vow he was terrified to make. She would give him the one thing he had never been given, a choice. That night, the cold deepened. A sharp, clear frost settled over the snow, making the world brittle and bright under a full moon. Elias did not come for the plate of food she left. A new fear, sharp and practical, cut through her sorrow. He had worked all day in the freezing air without a proper meal. He had run from her, but he could not run from the cold. She put on her cloak and boots, took the lantern, and stepped out into the night. The snow crunched under her feet. The barn was dark. The woodpile was silent. "Elias?" she called, her voice small in the vast, silver quiet. No answer. She walked past the barn, following the faint set of tracks he had worn in the snow. They led down toward the creek, a dark, jagged line in the valley bottom, its edges frozen, a ribbon of black water running in its center. She found him there. He was sitting on a fallen log, his back to her, staring at the dark, moving water. He was wearing his heavy coat, but he sat slumped, a figure of utter desolation. An empty bottle lay in the snow beside him. A second bottle, half full of whiskey, was in his hand. He did not turn as she approached. He must have heard her, but he did not move. He just stared at the creek, as if it held the answers to a question he could not ask. She stopped a few feet behind him. The lantern light cast their long shadows onto the snow. "Elias," she said softly, "you will freeze. You have not eaten." He took a long drink from the bottle, the movement stiff. "Go back to the cabin, Lydia!" His voice was a raw, rough sound, thick with whiskey and despair. "No." She walked around the log and stood in front of him. His face was a ruin in the moonlight. His eyes were haunted, sunk deep in shadow, looking at things she could not see. He was drunk, but it was not the drunkenness of a bully like Croft. It was the desperate, sorrowful drunkenness of a man trying to kill the part of himself that felt. "I wrote to the preacher," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I told him not to come." He looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. The haunted look was replaced by a slow, agonizing confusion. "Why?" "Because this," she gestured between them, "at the snow, at the cabin, is not a contract. I will not force you." He looked down at the bottle in his hands. "You should have left. You should have run. Back to Laramie. Back to anywhere." "I am not afraid of you, Elias." He gave a short, bitter laugh that died in his throat. "You should be. You saw in the store. You saw what I am." "I saw you protect me." "You saw my father," he whispered, the words so low she barely heard them. He stared into the black water. "You saw his hands." "Tell me," she said. She knelt in the snow beside him, her cloak pooling around her. She was not asking as a wife or a stranger. She was asking as a confession, a prayer. "Tell me what you see." He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the rush of the creek, the hiss of the ice. He lifted the bottle, then stopped, his hand shaking. He was a hard man," Elias began, his voice a monotone, as if reciting a lesson learned by rote. The town knew it, but they did not know. He looked at his own scarred knuckles, bathed in the moonlight. He had a temper that came up like a summer storm, fast and dark, and my mother, she was a quiet woman. Like the deer, she just tried to be invisible. He swallowed, the sound painful. It was never enough. Nothing was ever enough. The food was wrong. The fences were wrong. I was wrong. He took a ragged breath. That night, the snow was like this, so cold. He had been drinking. He said she had looked at another man in town, a store clerk. He said she was his, to do with as he pleased. Elias's eyes squeezed shut. The words came out of him, torn and raw, dredged up from a place he had kept locked for a decade. He started to hit her. He used his fists. And I was 16. I was big, even then. I had been taking it for years. But I could not her. I yelled at him. I told him to stop. He just laughed. He said I was next. He opened his eyes. They were hollow, empty of everything but the past. I grabbed the fireplace poker. I told him if he touched her again, I would kill him. He looked at me. He looked at me. And he smiled. He said, "The wolf pup has teeth." Then he turned back to her. I hit him. I hit him with the poker, not to kill, just to stop him. He fell. He knocked the oil lamp from the table. It shattered on the floor. The oil, the fire. It went up so fast. The whole wall, the curtains. She was screaming. His voice broke. He was no longer a big, silent man. He was a 16-year hooked boy, trapped in a burning house. I tried to get to her. The smoke was too thick. My father, he was on the floor. The fire was on him. I tried to pull her out. A beam fell. It cut her off. I could hear her screaming my name. He stopped. He was shaking. The deep, violent tremors she had seen before. I ran. I was the only one who ran. I got out. I stood in the snow. And I listened to them burn. He turned to Lydia, his face a mask of agony. The town, they whispered. They said I did it on purpose, to save her, that I was a hero. He shook his head, a single, violent motion. Or that I was a monster, that I was mad, like him, that I was a killer. They were both right. He finally looked down at his own hands, his voice dropping to a whisper of self-loathing. I did not save her. I tried to stop him. And I killed them both. I burned them alive. Everything I touch, he said, his voice cracking. I destroy. Everything I am supposed to love. I set on fire. He was consumed by his own guilt, convinced that his very nature was destructive, that love, desire, rage, it was all the same fire. Lydia looked at him, her heart breaking. She saw the years of silence, the self-imposed exile, the terror of his own hands. She finally understood. She knelt there in the snow and took the whiskey bottle from his unresisting fingers. She set it aside. Then she took his large, calloused, trembling hands in her own. He flinched, but he did not pull away. He was too broken. Love is not the fire, Elias, she said, her voice clear and strong in the cold night. Love is not the thing that burns. That is just hate. That is just pain. She squeezed his hands. Love, she said, her eyes locked on his, is what survives after. It is the part of you that tried to protect her. It is the part of you that knelt in the barn to save a calf. It is the part of you that has sat alone in this valley for 10 years, rather than risk hurting anyone else. That is not a monster. That is a man. He stared at her, his ragged breath pluming in the air. He looked at her as if she were speaking a language he had never heard, but desperately wanted to understand. He saw no judgment in her eyes, no fear, only a deep, steady acceptance. I killed them, he whispered, the last defense of his guilt. The fire killed them, she said fiercely. And the hate killed them. You were just a boy trying to stop it. You have been punishing that boy ever, CFR. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned forward. It was a movement of profound, aching need. He did not embrace her, but simply rested his forehead against hers. His body was trembling,
his hand still captive in hers. She felt the dampness of his tears on her own cheeks. "I am so alone," he breathed. "I know," she whispered. "So am I." The embrace began there, in the snow, by the frozen creek. It was not a kiss. It was a huddle for warmth. It was two broken, lonely people clinging to each other in the dark. Her arms went around his broad back, holding him. His arms, after a long, frozen moment, came up to encircle her waist, his grip hesitant, as if he were holding glass. Then the desperation came. The wall he had built for a decade had cracked. The need he had suppressed, the desire he had equated with violence, flooded through. His grip tightened, pulling her against his chest. He lifted his head, and his mouth found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was clumsy, raw, and desperate. It was a collision. It was the taste of whiskey, and cold, and 10 years of loneliness. He kissed her with the force of a drowning man, and she kissed him back, meeting his desperation with her own steady strength. She was not afraid. She held him, anchored him, her hands moving from his back to cradle his face. They were both trembling. When the kiss finally broke, they were both breathless. He looked at her, his eyes wild in the moonlight, a mixture of terror and agonizing want. He stood, pulling her up with him. He did not ask. He did not speak. He just scooped her into his arms, his hold strong and certain, and began to carry her back to the cabin. He moved through the snow as if she weighed nothing. He did not stop until he was inside, kicking the door shut behind them. He set her down gently by the fire, the lantern light and the moonlight mixing to cast the room in a soft glow. He stood there, looking at her. He was still trembling. The desire in his eyes was overwhelming, but it was at war with his deep-set fear. "Lydia," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I do not know how. I do not know how to be gentle. My father, he only knew how to hurt." It was his final confession, his most profound fear, that he could not touch her without breaking her. Lydia's heart swelled. She stepped toward him and placed her small, cold hand on his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart beneath her palm. "You do not have to know," she whispered. "You just have to be here, with me." She reached up, her fingers steady this time, and undid the first button of her dress. He did not run. He watched her, his breath caught in his throat. She undid the second. "You are not him," she said. She undid the third. "You will not hurt me." She taught him with touch. She taught him with patience. She took his large, scarred hand and pressed its palm to her cheek, letting him feel the warmth of her skin, the steadiness of her presence. He flinched, but he did not pull away. She guided his hand to her shoulder, to her waist, showing him that his touch could be a comfort, not a weapon. Their union was not a fire. It was a thaw. It was a slow, raw, emotional unraveling. It was a redemptive, clumsy, and sacred thing. It was the collision of two vast lonelinesses, a desperate need for forgiveness, and the quiet, stubborn hope for a new beginning. He was hesitant, uncertain, his movements careful, as if he were still expecting to break her, and she was patient, guiding him, her whispers and her touch reassuring him that he was safe, that she was safe. It was a discovery. It was the end of his exile. It was the end of her wandering. In the deep quiet of the night, long after, they lay in the narrow bed. The moon was high, its light a pale blue bar across the floor. He was on his back, staring at the ceiling, his body still, his breathing uneven. Lydia lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on his chest. She felt the dampness on his cheeks and realized he was weeping, not the racking sobs of his confession, but a silent, steady stream of tears, the release of a guilt he had carried for half his life. She said nothing. She simply moved her hand,
her fingers tracing the faded, silvery scars that marked his ribs and his chest. Scars, she knew, that had come from his father's hands, long before the fire. She traced them, one by one, an act of silent acceptance, learning the map of his pain. Outside, in the distant hills, a pack of wolves began to howl. It was a lonely, wild sound that spoke of the harshness of the land, of the hunger that stalked the cold. Elias heard it. He tensed. Then he let out a long, slow breath, a breath he seemed to have been holding for 10 years. He turned his head, his tears still wet on his face, and looked at her. He did not speak. He just lifted his arm and pulled her closer, his hold no longer hesitant, but sure. He wrapped her in his arms, his face burying in her hair, and held on. The wolves howled, but inside the cabin, for the first time, 2 broken hearts beat in a slow, steady, and quiet rhythm. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. The cabin, once a cage of silence and fear, became a refuge. Elias was a man relearning the world, and Lydia was his guide. He was still quiet, his words few, but his silence was no longer a wall. It was a shared space. He would watch her as she cooked, his eyes tracing her movements, as if she were a miracle he still did not quite believe. He was a man unlearning his own terror. His touch, when it came, was hesitant, his large, scarred hands almost fearful in their gentleness. He would reach out, his fingers brushing her hair, and then pull back, as if he had broken a rule. Lydia would take that same hand and hold it, pressing it to her cheek, teaching him, wordlessly, that his touch was not a weapon. They were an unfinished story, 2 people existing in the fragile, tender space between a confession and a vow. The outside world, however, does not long respect such boundaries. The news arrived on the back of a tired horse, carried by a circuit rider who looked at Lydia with open, pitying curiosity. He handed her a legal-looking envelope, tipped his hat to Elias, and rode on, clearly eager to spread the word in town that the widow and the madman were still living in sin. Lydia opened the letter. Her blood went cold. It was not from the preacher. It was from a law office in Laramie, acting on behalf of Mr. Silas Croft. She read the words, her comprehension slow, her dread growing with each line. The language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Croft was suing Elias Boone, not for assault, which she had feared, but for something older, and in its way, far more cruel. He was suing for harboring a debtor. The suit claimed that Lydia Grace, a widow, was still responsible for the outstanding debts of her late husband, and that by taking her in, housing her, and, the letter implied, in venomous, veiled terms, keeping her as his own. Elias Boone had assumed that debt. Croft was demanding payment in full. If he did not receive it, he would petition the court to place a lien on the Boone ranch. He meant to take everything. Lydia? She had not heard Elias come in. He was standing by the door, his face clouded with concern. She had gone pale as the snow outside. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She could not speak. She just held out the paper. He took it from her trembling hand. He read it, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. Lydia watched his face. She saw the confusion, then the slow, dark flush of understanding. She saw the muscles in his jaw clench, the stillness settle over him. It was not the panicked stillness she had seen before. This was something new. It was a cold, hard, and terrible calm. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it, very precisely, and placed it on the table. "Elias," she whispered. I did not know. I thought, when Thomas died, I thought it was done." "He is a snake," Elias said, his voice flat. He was not looking at her. He was looking through the wall, his eyes fixed on the distant town. "He uses the law like a club. We can write to the judge." Lydia stammered, her mind racing. "I can explain. I can work. I will go to town. I will find work. No. His voice was absolute. He turned and walked to the peg by the door, taking down his heavy sheepskin coat. A cold dread seized her.
Elias, what are you doing?
I am going to town.
No!
She ran to him, grabbing his arm.
Elias, no, that is what he wants. He wants to provoke you. He wants you to get angry. He wants the sheriff to lock you up so he can steal your land.
I am not going to get angry, Elias said. He looked down at her, his face a mask of cold resolve. I am going to pay him. Lydia's heart broke.
Pay him with what? We have nothing. This ranch. It is all there is.
He will not take this ranch, Elias said. He gently, firmly, removed her hand from his arm. He will not take it from you.
From us,
she insisted, tears welling in her eyes.
Elias, please, do not go. This is my debt, my shame. Do not let me be the one who brings this ruin to you.
He looked at her then, and the coldness in his eyes softened. Just for a moment, replaced by the profound, aching tenderness she had come to know. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear. You are not ruin.
Lydia,
he whispered.
You are the only thing that is not. You stay here, bolt the door. I will be back before dark.
He did not kiss her. He simply turned and left, his long, purposeful strides eating up the distance to the barn. Lydia stood by the window, her hand pressed to her mouth, and watched him saddle his horse. He rode out not with the frantic energy of a panicked man, but with the grim, steady pace of a soldier marching to a battle he knew he would lose. She watched until he was a small, dark speck against the snow, and then he was gone. She could not obey. She could not wait. The image of his hands, his wonderful, scarred hands, closing around Silas Croft's throat, was burned into her mind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Elias believed he was riding to town to pay a debt. But Croft would not accept money. He wanted blood. He wanted humiliation. He wanted to prove that Elias Boone was nothing but his father's violent shadow. She waited 1 hour. It was the longest hour of her life. The silence of the cabin was a screaming torment. Then, her decision made, she moved. She put on her own coat, grabbed the half-empty pouch of coffee from the shelf, and ran to the barn. The other horse, a gentle mare, was in her stall. Lydia saddled her, her hands clumsy, her heart pounding a sick rhythm against her ribs. She rode out, pushing the horse harder than she should have, following the lone set of tracks that led to town. The town was quiet. The thaw had set in, turning the main street into a river of mud and slush. She tied the mare outside the mercantile, her eyes scanning the street. His horse was not there. It was not at the sheriff's office. It was outside the saloon. She had never been inside a saloon. It was the one place a respectable woman, even a fallen one, did not go. She did not hesitate. She pushed through the swinging doors. The room was a haze of smoke, the smell of sour whiskey, and unwashed men. It went silent, the way the mercantile had. Every man at the tables, at the bar, turned to stare at her. They looked at her with open, leering curiosity. Then she saw him. Elias was not at the bar. He was at a back table. Silas Croft was there, leaning back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. 3 other men, friends of Croft's, were at the table with him. Elias was standing. He had a small, leather pouch in his hand. He placed it on the table. "That is all I have," Elias said. His voice was low, controlled. "It is half of what you ask. You will take it, and you will drop the suit." Croft laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. He did not even look at the pouch of money. He looked at Elias, his eyes glittering with malice. "Half?" Croft said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You think this is about money, Boone? You think you can pay for her reputation with a few coins?" Elias went still. "This is about the debt. This is about a piece of property that owes me. Croft said, leaning forward. Her husband died in my debt. That makes her my debt. And you thick-headed brute, you stole her. The debt is mine now, Elias said, his voice dropping. Take the money, and leave her name out of this. Her name? Croft sneered. She has no name. She is just a woman who manipulates men to get by. She is a whore, Boone, and she has been playing you for a fool. Idia saw it happen. It was like watching a mountain split apart. The control Elias had been holding, the iron grip on his own nature, snapped. He did not speak. He did not warn. He moved. He grabbed the front of Croft's shirt, hauling him bodily out of the chair. The table went over, scattering cards and glasses. Croft's friends scrambled back. Elias slammed Croft against the back wall, the impact shaking dust from the timbers. He did not hit him. It was worse. His left hand was bunched in Croft's shirt, pinning him. His right hand, that scarred, broken hand, rose and wrapped around Silas Croft's throat. The saloon erupted. Men yelled, jumping to their feet. But no one moved to intervene. They were watching, frozen, as Elias Boone, the madman of the foothills, finally proved them all right. Elias was not there. His face was a mask of black, unrecognizable rage. He was his father's son. He was the fire. He was the violence he had kept chained for a decade. Croft's face was turning purple. He was clawing at Elias's arm, his eyes bulging. He was dying. Elias! Lydia screamed his name. It cut through the smoke, through the shouting, through the red fog of his rage. He did not hear her. Elias! She screamed again, running forward, shoving men out of her way. He froze. His hand was still on Croft's throat, but the killing pressure eased. He turned his head, his eyes wild, unseeing, bloodshot. He did not recognize her. She reached him. She did not try to pull him off. She just stood in front of him, close enough to touch, and spoke his name, her voice low and steady, a prayer against his madness. Elias, come back. He looked at her. He blinked. The red haze cleared. He saw her. He saw Lydia. And then he saw his own hand. He looked down at what he was doing, at the man he was murdering, and a look of profound, agonizing horror washed over his face. He let go. Silas Croft collapsed to the floor, gasping, choking, a raw purple mark around his neck. Elias stumbled back, hitting the wall. He stared at his own hands, holding them up as if they were covered in blood. He was shaking, convulsing, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He was lost, trapped in the nightmare of his own past, his own proof. Lydia did not go to him, not yet. She turned from him and stood over Silas Croft, who was crawling and coughing on the filthy floor. She looked at him with a cold fury he had never seen. Then she turned and faced the entire silent saloon. She faced the leering men, the shocked bartender, and Sheriff Brody, who had just come through the door, his hand on his gun. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room, shaking with a strength she did not know she possessed. This man, she said, pointing at Croft, has been threatening my family. He filed a suit against my husband. A murmur went through the room. She felt their eyes, the scorn of the gossips, the shock of the ranchers. Sheriff Brody pushed forward, his face grim. Your husband, Mrs. Grace? He looked past her, at Elias, who was still slumped against the wall, broken, his eyes shut, lost in his own shame. I was not aware a marriage had taken place. The preacher is still in town. I have no papers, no proof. It was the law. She had no standing. She was a widow, a debtor, a fallen woman. Elias, she said, her voice soft. He did not move. Elias, she said again, louder, her voice an anchor. I need you. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. He saw her, standing alone in a room full of hostile men, her head high, her gaze steady. He saw her claiming him, even after what he had done. He saw her faith. The shame did not disappear, but something else rose to meet it. He pushed himself off the wall. He was no longer the raging animal. He was no longer the broken child. He was just a man. He walked slowly, deliberately, across the floor. He did not look at Croft. He did not look at the sheriff. He walked to Lydia's side. He stood beside her, a giant, solid presence. He looked at Sheriff Brody. He was still trembling, but his eyes were clear. Slowly, he reached up and removed his hat, holding it in both hands. "Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet, but it filled the room. "She is my wife in every way that matters. This is my home." He gestured, not at the ranch, but at Lydia, "and I will not let him, or any man, threaten her." The sheriff held his gaze. He looked at Elias, the man he had always known as mad. He looked at Lydia, the woman who had faced him down. He looked at Silas Croft, who was being helped to a chair, his face a ruin, his greed and malice clear to everyone. Brody was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the frontier. He knew justice was not always found in paper. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Silas," he said, his voice hard, "you are a fool. You pushed a man. I saw it. These men saw it." He gestured to the silent crowd. "You provoked him. You pressed this suit, and I will find a dozen men to swear you attacked him first. I will have you in a cell for a month." Croft's eyes, watery and full of hate, met the sheriff's. He knew he was beaten. "Now get out of my town," Brody said. "I do not want to see your face again." He watched as Croft's friends helped him stumble out the door. Then he turned to Elias. "Son," he said, his voice softer, "get your wife. Go home. And for God's sake, Elias, stay there. Do not make me come and get you." Elias nodded once. He put his hat back on his head. He looked at Lydia. Then, in front of the entire town, he held out his hand. She took it. Her fingers laced with his. His grip was firm, steady. They did not speak. They turned and walked, hand in hand, out of the saloon. The crowd of men parted for them, their faces a mixture of scorn, awe, and grudging respect. They stepped out into the muddy street, into the cold, clean air. They rode home in silence. Two riders, a single, united shadow against the setting sun. They did not speak as they tended the horses. The shared, quiet rhythm of their chores was the only comfort. The sun had set, and the cabin was filled with the purple light of dusk. Lydia moved to the stove and began to build up the fire for the night. The small cabin was warm, safe, a haven. She reached into the pocket of her dress. Her fingers closed around the simple, worn gold band. Her first husband's ring. It was the last ghost, the last tie to Lydia Grace, the unlucky widow, the debtor, the woman who brought ruin. Elias was watching her. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands, his face shadowed, his eyes full of a quiet, weary love. She looked at the ring in her palm. She thought of Thomas, a good, gentle man. She would always honor his memory, but he was her past. Elias was her home. She opened the small iron door of the stove. The new flames leaped up, casting a bright, flickering orange light. She held the ring for a moment longer. Then, she dropped it into the fire. She did not watch it melt. She watched Elias. The firelight danced in his eyes. He watched the ring disappear, and it was as if he were watching all the old ghosts burn with it. The ghost of his father, the ghost of the fire, the ghost of the boy who had stood in the snow and listened to the screaming, the ghost of the man who had wrapped his hands around another's throat. He was watching the past turn to ash. He let out a long, slow breath, a breath he had been holding for a lifetime. The tension left his shoulders. The haunting in his eyes receded, leaving only the man. He walked to her, and for the first time, with no hesitation, no fear, he wrapped his arms around her and held her, his face buried in her hair. The days that followed were the beginning of spring. The great drifts of snow melted, and the prairie, brown and sodden, began to show the first faint, tentative hints of green. The broken beam in the barn was their first task. They worked together. The outside world did not exist. There was only the ranch, the clean air, and the work. Elias, with his quiet strength, hoisted the new, heavy pine beam into place. Lydia stood on a crate, holding it steady, her smaller hands securing the pegs. "You hit that peg like you are mad at it," Elias said, his voice dry. Lydia, her arm aching, paused. "I am just making sure it stays." "You will split the wood, is what you will do," he said. He took the mallet from her. "Like this, slow, firm." She watched him. "You sound like you know what you are doing." A small smile touched his lips. "I built this barn the first time." "Then you should have built it right," she countered, her own smile matching his. Elias stopped. He looked at her, his eyes wide, as if he had never heard the sound of her teasing. A low chuckle started in his chest. It was a rusty, unused sound. He tried to suppress it, but it broke free. He laughed. Lydia, stunned by the beautiful, simple sound, started to laugh with him. A real, bright, sudden laugh that echoed in the rafters of the barn. It was the first time. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of healing. But the world, as it always does, pressed in. The loneliness of the prairie was a vast, open thing, and the cabin was a very small dot in the middle of it. Their nearest neighbor, a rancher named Jedediah Morse, rode by, his wagon loaded with fencing. He saw them, Elias and Lydia, working on the porch. Lydia raised a hand in greeting. Morse just stared, his face grim. He snapped his reins and deliberately turned his wagon, taking the long, muddy detour around their property line. They were pariahs. The gossip from town filtered out, carried on the same wind that brought the spring. They were the madman and his mistress. They were outcasts. Lydia felt the sting of it, the isolation, but it was different now. She looked at Elias, who was carving a piece of wood, his face calm, his hands steady. He was no longer the man hiding from the world. He was a man who had chosen his world. They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sky bleed into a deep, bruised purple. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and empty. It was a hard land, a land that did not forgive. "They will never stop talking, will they?" Lydia whispered, leaning her head on his shoulder. Elias looked out at the vast, darkening expanse. He slipped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low rumble against her hair. They sat in the encroaching cold, two outcasts, two survivors, but for the first time in either of their lives, as the empty darkness of the prairie pressed in, neither of them felt alone. The snows of that long winter did not just melt, they surrendered. They retreated from the slopes, ran in loud, rushing rivers down the coulees, and left the prairie a sodden, hopeful brown. The air, for so long a sharp, sterile blade of cold, softened. It began to carry new smells, the damp, dark scent of uncovered earth, the spice of new sage, and the sweet promise of cottonwood buds. Spring came to the valley, and with it, a new kind of silence. The months passed, marked not by the calendar, but by the slow, steady rhythm of the earth's tilting. The silence that had once been a wall of terror and shame between Elias and Lydia thawed. Just as the ground had, it was replaced by a quiet that was as comfortable and necessary as breathing. They moved like two halves of one rhythm. The boundaries of the cabin dissolved. The ranch became their shared space, their shared work. Elias, who had only ever worked to survive, to keep the ghosts at bay, now worked to build. He rode the fence lines, his hammer strokes a steady, ringing thwack, thwack, thwack that echoed in the clear air. He was not just repairing the wire, he was mending the borders of his own world, making it solid, making it safe. Lydia, in turn, claimed the earth by the cabin. With a spade and a hopeful heart, she broke the sod for a small garden. The soil was rocky and stubborn, but she worked it with a fierce patience. Her hands, long, pale, and soft from a town life, growing brown and calloused. Elias, watching her from the barn, said nothing, but the next morning she found he had hauled 3 heavy sacks of rich, black soil up from the river bottom and left them by her plot. She planted beans and squash, carrots and potatoes. She planted a small, hopeful row of wildflowers she had found blooming by the creek. This patch of turned earth was her anchor, her faith in the future. It was a promise that they would be here to see the harvest. Their evenings fell into a pattern of shared peace. They would eat at the small table. The door of the cabin opened to the cool, purple dusk. The conversations that had begun in whispers, in halting confessions, now flowed with an easy, quiet cadence. He would tell her about the land, his voice, once so rusty, now sure. He taught her the names of the birds, how to read the clouds for weather, how to know when the creek would rise. She, in turn, shared the small memories of her life before. Not the tragedy, but the simple things. She told him of her mother's kitchen, of the books she had read, of the simple, foolish desire to one day see the ocean. He would listen, his gaze fixed on her face, his eyes, no longer haunted, now just quiet and deep, and filled with her. He was a man learning to live outside his own shadow. The terror of his own hands had faded, replaced by a new, wondrous caution. His touch was still hesitant, but it was no longer born of fear. It was born of reverence. He would reach out in the middle of the night and just rest his palm on her back, a silent, wondering gesture, as if to confirm she was real. And she, in her sleep, would lean into that touch, an answer that needed no words. They were 2 outcasts. Yes, the world beyond their valley had not forgotten them. No one rode by to visit. The town remained a distant, hostile place. But here, in the vast, empty prairie, they had built a world that was full. They had found a fragile, powerful solace. They were not lonely. The happiness was so new, so tender, that neither of them dared to name it. They simply lived inside it, breathing it in like the clean spring air. The tragedy began as all tragedies in that land do, not with a sound, but with a sign. It was a hot afternoon in late July. The prairie was tinder dry. The grasses cured to a pale, brittle gold. Lydia was weeding her garden, the sun hot on her back. When she first smelled it, it was not the familiar, woody scent of their own cook fire. This was a sharp, biting smell, an acrid tang of pine and burning grass, carried on a wind that had suddenly, nervously, shifted to the south. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked south, down the valley. The sky, which had been a clear, endless blue, was stained. A high, yellowish-brown haze was building on the horizon, like a great, dirty thumbprint smudging the world. Elias was at the barn, repairing a harness. He walked out, his head up, sniffing the air like an animal. He did not look at the sky. He looked at the horses. They were restless, stamping in the corral, their ears pricked, their eyes white.
"Elias?"
Lydia said, her voice small. He did not answer for a long moment. He just stared south, his face going still. It was a stillness she had not seen in months. The cold, blank stillness of the man she had first met. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat.
"What is it? Is it a fire?"
"It is a prairie fire," he said, his voice hard. "Driven by a south wind. It is moving fast. Go inside. Pack your things."
"Pack?"
she said, confused. "What? Should I get the water buckets?" "Lydia." He turned to her, and the man she knew was gone. In his place was a stranger, his eyes wide and dark with a terror so profound it stopped her heart. It was the same panic she had seen in the barn during the storm, the same madness she had seen in the saloon. "There is no fighting this, not with this wind. It will be here by nightfall. Take the mare. Take the coffee and the bread. Ride north. Do not stop until you reach the Sweetwater." Her mind could not process his words. Ride? Leave? What about you? What about the cabin, the animals? "There is no cabin," he said, his voice breaking, his hands clenching at his sides. "There is no ranch. It is just wood. It will burn. It always burns." He grabbed her arm, his grip not tender, but bruising. He started pulling her toward the barn. "You have to leave, now!" She finally understood. She ripped her arm from his grasp. "No, I am not leaving you." "You do not understand," he roared, his voice cracking. He was shaking, his whole body seized by the memory of a different fire. "This is what happens. This is the end. It is the same wind, the same. I brought you here, and I have doomed you. It is history. It is repeating." He was not seeing the dry grass. He was seeing his mother, his father. He was seeing the past rising from the ashes to consume him again. He was convinced, in that moment, that he was the curse, that his small, fragile happiness had called the fire down upon them. "Elias, no!" she cried, grabbing his face, forcing him to look at her. "This is not history. This is just a fire. It is just wind and grass. It is not your fire. It is not the past." "It will kill you," he whispered, his face ashen. "Like it killed her. I will not watch that again." "Then you will not," she said, her voice fierce, steady, an anchor in his panic. "You will not watch, because we are going to fight. I am not leaving you. I am not leaving our home. Not now. Not ever. Do you hear me?" He stared at her, his ragged breaths tearing at his chest. He saw her, her face smudged with dirt from the garden, her eyes blazing with a strength that defied his own terror. She was not the quiet, frightened deer his mother had been. She was not leaving. Her courage broke his panic. The terror did not leave, but it receded, replaced by a grim, desperate clarity. He nodded. Once. The man, her Elias, was back. "The river," he said, his voice hoarse. "We have to get the animals to the river shallows and soak the cabin. It is all we can do." The world shrank. The smoke, no longer a distant haze, was a rolling, churning wall. The sun was obscured, the day cast in an eerie, hellish orange light. Ash, like black snow, began to fall, dusting Lydia's hair, her shoulders. The smell was choking, the heat a palpable, pressing thing. They worked. They did not speak. They yelled. There was no time. "The horses! Get the horses!" Elias bellowed. He ran to the corral, Lydia at his heels. The horses were mad with fear, rearing, screaming. Elias, with a calm he did not feel, grabbed the mare's halter. "Get the stallion! Lead him! Do not ride him! To the creek! Go!" Lydia grabbed the stallion's rope. The horse pulled, fighting her, but she held on, her feet slipping in the dry dirt. She ran, dragging the animal, her lungs burning, toward the thin line of green that marked the creek. Elias was at the well, working the pump handle with a frantic, punishing rhythm, bucket after bucket. He did not bother to carry them. He just threw them, sloshing water onto the cabin walls, the porch, the new beam he had just set. He was trying to soak the wood, to make it harder to catch. Lydia returned, her chest heaving. "They are in the water! They will not stay! They—" "The cows!" he yelled, already running to the small barn. "We have to cut them loose!" They drove the two bawling cows, prodding them with sticks, toward the safety of the water. The smoke was thicker now, a solid, blinding fog. They were coughing, their eyes streaming. The heat was like a blast furnace, the fire no longer a distant threat, but a roaring monster just beyond the ridge. They could hear it now, a low, deep, unearthly roar like 1,000 freight trains, a sound that shook the ground. "Back to the cabin." Elias grabbed her hand. "The blankets! Soak them! We have to cover the roof!" They ran, hand in hand, the world ending around them. They stripped the bed, grabbed every piece of cloth they owned. They soaked them in the horse trough, the water already warm. Elias climbed onto the low roof, Lydia passing him the heavy, dripping blankets. He laid them out, a desperate, futile defense against the coming storm. The fire reached the ridge. It was not a line of flame. It was an ocean. It crested the hill, a solid wall of fire 50 feet high, and poured down into their small valley. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that made them stagger. "The well!" Elias jumped from the roof, grabbing Lydia. "We have to keep the pump going! Wet the walls!" They stood side by side, their shoulders touching. Elias pumped, his muscles straining, his face black with soot. Lydia grabbed the buckets, no longer throwing the water, but dashing it against the walls, which were already steaming. Embers, large as a man's fist, rained down from the sky, landing on the roof, hissing on the wet blankets. A sudden, superheated gust of wind tore past them. The barn, which they had not had time to soak, exploded. It did not catch fire. It simply detonated, a dry, wooden bomb. The heat wave threw them both to the ground. Lydia screamed as the fire engulfed the building they had rebuilt together, the building where he had laughed. "Elias!" He was already up, pulling her to her feet. "It is lost! The cabin! We have to save the cabin!" The fire was on them. It was not just in front, it was on all sides. The dry prairie grass flashed and was gone. The heat was unbearable, searing their lungs. The air itself was fire. "It is too hot!" Lydia cried, her voice a raw croak. "We have to go! To the river!" "No!" Elias yelled, his face a mask of terrible, stubborn grief. "Not the cabin! I will not lose this!" He grabbed a bucket, but it was too late. The dry kindling by the woodpile ignited, and in a heartbeat, the fire leaped from the ground to the porch. The new beam, the one he had carved, was burning. Elias roared, a sound of pure denial. He charged the porch, intending to beat the flames out with his bare hands. "Elias, no!" As he stepped onto the porch, a sound cracked through the roar of the flames. The old, fire-weakened roof support for the porch, the one he had meant to replace next, gave way. The burning beam, heavy as a coffin, crashed down. It struck him across the back, pinning him to the floor of the porch. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound. Lydia saw it. The world went silent. The roar of the fire, her own fear, it all disappeared. There was only him. He was trapped, his legs and back pinned, the flames of the beam licking at his clothes. He was trying to push it, but it was too heavy. His eyes, wide and terrified, found hers. She ran. She did not think. She ran onto the burning porch, the heat blistering her face, her dress. She grabbed the beam. The wood was alive, burning coal, the fire searing through her thin sleeves, into the skin of her hands and forearms. She did not feel it. She screamed, a raw, inhuman sound torn from her throat, and lifted. The beam, heavy with pine and fire, moved. It shifted, just an inch. Elias shoved, scrambling, crawling backward, dragging his leg. He was free. She let the beam drop. She grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled. "Get up! Get up!" They fell off the porch together, rolling in the dirt, beating at the sparks on each other's clothes. The cabin was a lost cause. The entire porch an inferno, the fire licking at the main walls. "The river!" Elias croaked. Grabbing her, he was limping, his back scorched, but he was moving. "Run!" They ran. They did not look back. They ran through a tunnel of smoke and ash, the world a roaring, orange hell. They plunged, half falling, down the steep bank of the creek and collapsed into the shallow, cold water. They huddled together, the water swirling around their waists. Elias pulled her tight against his chest, turning his back to the inferno, shielding her body with his own. The fire roared over them. It consumed the valley. The cottonwoods on the bank exploded into flame, their leaves vanishing in a whoosh of white heat. The air was unbreathable, a solid, scalding thing. They pressed their faces to the water, gasping as the firestorm raged above them, so close it singed their hair. They knelt in the river, two small, terrified souls, and held on as the world burned. The roar faded first. It was replaced by the sharp crack and crash of falling trees, the hiss of embers hitting the water. The heat, which had been a physical weight, began to recede. Lydia did not know how long they stayed there. Hours, a lifetime. When she finally dared to lift her head, the world was gone. Gray dawn. The sun was a dull, red coin in a sky thick with smoke. As far as she could see, in every direction, was a landscape of black and gray. The earth was ash. The hills were bare, black spikes. The air smelled of soot and ruin. Elias stirred, his arms still locked around her. He slowly, stiffly, turned. He looked. The barn was gone. Not a single timber remained. Just a smoking black square on the ground. The fences were gone. The corral was gone. Her garden was a patch of gray dust. But the cabin stood. It was a miracle, a terrible, wounded miracle. The porch was gone, burned away to nothing. The front wall was scorched black, the windows shattered. The blankets on the roof were burned embers. But the main logs had held. The thick, soaked timber had refused to yield. It was standing, scarred, violated but standing. They waded from the creek, their legs numb, their clothes soaked and torn. They walked, like ghosts, through the gray ash of their new world. They stood before the ruined porch. They were both shaking, from cold, from shock. Lydia looked at the blackened wall, the smoking ground. She looked at Elias. His face was black, his hair singed. He was staring at the cabin with the eyes of a man seeing a resurrection. She reached up, her own hands a raw, red agony, and touched his face. He looked down at her. He saw her, her own face streaked with soot and tears, her dress half burned. Lydia gave him a small, trembling smile. "We survived," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. She leaned her head against his chest. "We survived your fire." He closed his eyes. The last ghost, the one that had haunted him for a decade, the one that had risen in the smoke. Finally, truly. Let him go. He was not his father. He was not the boy who had run. He was the man who had stayed. He wrapped his arms around her, his burned back screaming in protest, and held her, his face buried in her smoky hair. The new porch beam was pine, cured for a year, straight and true. It took them a week to find the strength to begin, to clear the ash, to cut the new wood. The land was black, but at the very edges of the creek, a few blades of green grass were already pushing, stubbornly, through the soot. Elias set the beam in place. It was the last piece. The cabin was whole again. He took his knife, the one he used for skinning rabbits, and began to carve. He worked slowly. His hands, which had once been so afraid to touch, now steady and sure. Lydia sat on the step beside him, watching. Her hands were wrapped in clean white bandages. They were a raw, painful mess. The burns deep, but they would heal. She watched him carve the letters, deep into the wood. He was not carving his name. He was carving hers. Lydia. When he was done, he looked at it. A new mark, a new beginning. She reached out, her bandaged hand, clumsy and thick, and rested it over his. She laid her burned, healing hand on his scarred, strong one, right over the handle of the knife. He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. They sat there, together, on the porch of their scarred, surviving home. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and empty, a vast, blackened quiet. But for the first time, truly, in all their lives, neither of them felt alone. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with all of you, so please comment with where you are listening from. Be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.